He thought he could intimidate just another face on the street, but within minutes, Officer Brent Walker would realize he had just picked the wrong woman to cross. Before the story unfolds, tell us, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or state in the comments. That morning, I wasn't dressed in my usual robes of authority. I was simply Evelyn Carter, a woman running a few minutes behind schedule on a cloudy Thursday in Brookstone, Texas. Tossing a modest navy blazer over my shoulders, I slipped my worn leather bag into the back seat of my dusty 2011 Toyota Corolla and grabbed a lukewarm coffee from the corner gas station, waving briefly at the attendant who knew me only as Miss Eve. I liked it that way, blending in, living, simply avoiding the formalities and barriers that came with the title of judge. As I drove down Maple Avenue, my mind flipped through the docket for the day. A couple of minor hearings, one sentencing, and paperwork that had piled higher than I cared to admit. I barely noticed the patrol car trailing 2 vehicles behind me until I signaled to turn left and saw those flashing lights fill my rearview mirror. My stomach sank, not from guilt, but from a familiar bone-deep weariness. I pulled over promptly near a quiet strip mall, placing both hands firmly at 10 and 2 on the wheel, my fingers steady, but my breath just a touch too shallow. Through the mirror, I caught a glimpse of him. Young, stocky build, storming toward my car with the kind of aggression that screamed more personal than professional. I rolled the window down halfway and kept my tone even respectful. "Good morning, officer. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" I said, careful to keep my voice low and non-threatening. He didn't answer my question. His nameplate read Brent Walker, and his jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. "License and registration." Now he barked, hand hovering dangerously close to the weapon on his belt, narrating every movement out loud. I reached slowly for my purse. Still his posture tense like a coiled spring. "I'm retrieving my wallet, officer," I said, but the look in his eyes told me it didn't matter what I said. Or did. He had already made up his mind about me. Something in him bristled at my calm, maybe mistaking it for defiance. Before I could even hand over my ID, he yanked open the car door with a force that rattled the frame. "Out of the car," he demanded. Time slowed for a second. I weighed my options, all of them bad. Slowly, carefully, I unbuckled my seatbelt and stepped out onto the cracked asphalt, feeling the stares of early morning shoppers and gas station clerks begin to pierce the air like arrows. I thought complying would de-escalate things. I was wrong, Brent. Walker didn't ask questions. He didn't issue warnings. His hand flew across my face in one brutal, unprovoked slap, the sound ringing out louder than the startled cries that erupted around us. My head snapped sideways, the metallic tang of blood blooming on my tongue. I straightened slowly, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me stumble. That was the moment when I realized this was no mistake. This was a decision. As I stood there, the sting from Officer Brent Walker's hand still radiating across my cheek, I could feel the entire atmosphere shift around me. People at the gas station had frozen their conversations, cut short, coffee cups midair, eyes wide in disbelief as the reality of what they had just witnessed settled heavy in the air like an unexpected storm. Walker's breathing was ragged, almost as if he had struck not just out of authority, but out of something uglier, something festering and personal. And for a split second, he seemed almost satisfied, like he had proven a point that no one else understood but him. I tasted the blood in my mouth, thick and bitter, and my fingers twitched with the urge to wipe it away. But I didn't. Instead, I steadied myself, pulling my blazer back over my shoulder with slow, deliberate movements, my face blank, but my heart hammering hard enough to make my ribs ache. "You just assaulted a sitting judge," I said quietly, each word measured, not shouted, but cutting through the thickening air with the precision of a gavel dropping in a silent courtroom. He scoffed, an ugly sound born of disbelief or arrogance. Maybe both, as if the notion was too ridiculous to entertain, as if a woman who looked like me standing in this old Corolla, wearing a plain blazer and jeans, could ever belong to a world he respected. I saw the confusion flicker across his face as I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket, hands slow, narrating every motion, not for him, but for the audience, now pulling out phones and hitting record with trembling fingers, their instincts telling them that this moment, this injustice needed to be captured. I pulled out the badge, heavy, unmistakable, gleaming gold, even under the muted Texas morning light, the official seal of the state Supreme Court, catching the sun and sending a glint that seemed to slice right through his certainty. His smirk faltered, eyes darting from the badge to my face and back again, mouth opening but no words coming out. A woman nearby gasped, audibly, clutching her purse tighter, while a man filling up his pickup truck muttered something under his breath that I couldn't quite catch but felt like a prayer or a curse. Phones were up everywhere now. It was too late for Brent Walker to control the story, too late to hide what he had done, too late to pretend that his assumptions, his choices were anything but laid bare for the world to see. The energy shifted palpably, the crowd pressing closer, not threateningly, but with the weight of silent judgment, their faces a gallery of disbelief, anger, and something harder to define resolve. Walker's hand twitched near his belt again, an instinct, a reflex, the kind of movement that could ignite a tragedy in less than a heartbeat. But he hesitated. Even he could feel the eyes on him. The judgment, the danger, not from any one person, but from the collective truth, now too large to suppress. A teenage boy standing a few feet away raised his phone higher, steady hands capturing every second, and Walker turned sharply, barking at him to stop filming, voice cracking under the strain. But no one moved, no one lowered their gaze. And in that frozen moment, I realized something more powerful than any badge had taken hold here, the truth. I straightened my spine, ignoring the throbbing ache in my face, letting the silence stretch just a second longer. Before speaking again, voice low but carrying clear as a bell across the growing crowd. You're going to answer for this, and this time there was no scoffing, no bravado, just a pale, trembling officer trapped in a reality he had created with his own two hands. As Officer Brent Walker stood there paralyzed by fear and disbelief, I slowly, deliberately turned my body just enough so that the glinting badge in my hand caught the light again, letting everyone within eyesight see exactly who he had just assaulted. The murmurs around us grew louder now, boiling from low gasps into a restless rumble. The kind of sound that signaled a crowd shifting from passive witnesses into active participants in a reckoning that could no longer be stopped. Brent's face turned a sickly shade of gray, his breathing shallow, his posture faltering as if the very foundation he had stood upon moments earlier was crumbling under his boots. A woman near the pumps let out a sharp, angry bark of laughter, and someone else, maybe a man from across the street, yelled, "You messed up big time." I didn't flinch, didn't move beyond what was necessary to keep the badge visible. The pounding in my head was growing stronger now, the ache blooming down my neck, but I locked it away because the moment demanded composure, demanded strength greater than the physical pain screaming under my skin. Brent's hand still hovered awkwardly near his belt, twitching every few seconds, as if some instinct deep inside him wanted to salvage the last scraps of control he thought he had. But the sight of a dozen phones raised recording every awkward step he took, every blink of fear he showed, kept him frozen. Even he wasn't foolish enough to think he could erase what had already been burned into pixels and memories. A teenager in a red hoodie took a bold step forward, phone steady voice clear and unafraid. "Smile for the camera officer," he said, the sarcasm biting clean through the heavy air. Brent's eyes darted around, searching for an escape that didn't exist. I could almost see the calculations spinning desperately behind his rigid face, but there was no protocol for this. No training manual that could instruct him how to claw his way out of the hole he had dug with his own hands. His radio crackled at his hip, a voice calling for a unit check, but he didn't answer. Instead, he stumbled backward, a few paces like a man slowly realizing he had walked into quicksand and there was no branch to grab onto. Finally, with fumbling fingers, he brought the radio to his mouth and muttered something about requesting immediate backup, his voice thin and unconvincing. He didn't mention what had really happened. Here didn't say that he had struck a Supreme Court judge, didn't admit that he had lost control in front of a dozen witnesses whose loyalty now belonged to the truth and not the badge. I stood silently, letting him twist in the growing tension, my arms folded loosely, the badge still prominently displayed against the navy blue of my blouse, my body language saying everything my voice did not. "I will not run, I will not cower, I will not let you define this moment." Brent shifted from foot to foot, mumbling under his breath, as if trying to convince himself that somehow this could still be salvaged, but it was too late. The narrative had slipped from his fingers the second his hand connected with my face, and no amount of shouting or intimidation would bring it back under his control. More sirens howled in the distance, now growing closer, and I caught the flicker of red and blue lights bouncing against the glass windows of the K-Station convenience store. I didn't know yet how this day would end, but standing there under the hot gaze of dozens of righteous eyes and the indifferent recording lens of history, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: justice long denied to so many in situations. just like this one was finally going to have its day. The screech of tires on asphalt snapped the tension like a rubber band stretched too far, and two patrol cars came roaring into the lot, doors flying open before the engines had even settled. Two officers emerged, one a tall Latino man with a calm, wary demeanor, the other a younger white woman whose hand hovered near her holster, scanning the scene with wide, uncertain eyes. I didn't move, didn't say a word. The badge still glinted in my hand like a silent accusation as Brent Walker shuffled awkwardly a few steps back, sweat now trickling down his temple. His earlier bravado evaporated under the crushing weight of reality in public scrutiny. The Latino officer, Sergeant Luis Ortega, approached cautiously, taking in the sight of me, standing firm, the forming crowd, and Brent's flushed, panicked face. "Ma'am, are you injured?" he asked, voice respectful but edged with urgency, and for the first time since the slap, a ripple of acknowledgement eased into my muscles. Not safety yet, but something like the beginning of accountability. I nodded once, slow and deliberate. This officer assaulted me during a traffic stop without cause. I said, my voice carrying enough to cut through the murmuring crowd without needing to shout. I held my badge higher in letting the new arrivals see it plainly, their eyes widening as the seal caught the sun again. Brent opened his mouth, some desperate protest clawing its way out, but it died before it could find form, because behind the new officers, a third car was pulling in, an unmarked black SUV with government plates, and from it stepped Lieutenant Marcus Bennett, a man whose reputation for no-nonsense integrity was known from one end of Brookstone to the other. His boots hit the ground hard, his sunglasses already shoved onto his forehead, his face set like granite as he scanned the chaos with laser precision. His gaze locked onto mine, then flickered to Brent, and something cold and final settled in the air. He didn't rush, didn't bark orders. He simply walked with the calm of a man who understood that his every movement would ripple through a situation already trembling at the edge. "Judge Carter, are you all right?" he asked, voice low but resonating with authority. "Physically, yes," I replied, though the throbbing in my jaw told a different story. Lieutenant Bennett turned his full attention to Brent, then his expression unreadable, but his intent unmistakable. He closed the distance between them in a few steady strides and said almost conversationally, "Officer Walker, hand me your badge and weapon." For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Brent's face crumpled. First confusion, then denial. Then a slow dawning horror as he realized there was no saving himself with bluster or excuses. His fingers fumbled clumsily at his belt, unclipping the badge with trembling hands, unholstering the firearm like it weighed 100 pounds, passing both to Bennett with the defeated slump of a man stripped of everything he thought made him powerful. The crowd, now thick around the perimeter, didn't cheer, didn't jeer. They simply watched, solemn and unblinking, as justice, however small and incomplete, began to unfold before their eyes. Lieutenant Bennett handed the weapon off to Ortega and turned back to Brent. Voice sharp but not raised. "You are relieved of duty pending investigation. You are not to leave town." Brent nodded dumbly, shoulders sagging, the reality sinking in with every heavy word. I watched all of it not with triumph, but with a deep, resonant sadness, because I knew that this moment, as necessary as it was, couldn't undo the centuries that had made it possible. But standing there, surrounded by strangers who refused to look away, I felt the faintest flicker of something precious: hope. As Lieutenant Marcus Bennett secured Officer Brent Walker's badge and weapon, the sirens that once pierced the air had now faded into a low hum of dread. The gathered crowd remained forming a silent half-circle around us, recording, murmuring, waiting for the next chapter of a story none of us had intended to write, but that now none of us could walk away from. I stood still, the pain in my cheek deepening into a hard-throbbing knot, but I ignored it. Across the lot, I noticed the gas station manager stepping cautiously out from behind the counter, waving a hand and calling out, "It's all on video. Security cameras caught everything." His voice strained but clear enough to carry a beacon of documentation in a world where truth too often depends on who's willing to see it. Lieutenant Bennett gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, already pulling out his radio to coordinate securing the footage, moving with the quiet urgency of a man who understood just how fast bad decisions could spiral into something even uglier, if not handled with a brutal transparency. Meanwhile, Brent stood by his cruiser, head bowed, rocking slightly on his heels like a man waiting for a punishment he couldn't predict, but knew he deserved. A young woman in a denim jacket called out sharply from the crowd, You thought you could just get away with it, huh? Her voice cracking, not from anger but from the betrayal layered underneath it. The moment broke something loose. More voices joined in, not shouting, not taunting, but laying down a heavy, undeniable truth. This wasn't an isolated mistake. This wasn't about one bad cop having a bad day. This was a symptom of a sickness far older and deeper than any of us standing there could cure in a single afternoon. My phone buzzed incessantly against my hip, but I didn't reach for it. The world outside this gas station that was already spinning. I knew the footage spreading across the internet faster than any of us could contain the narrative. Escaping Brent Walker's grip, the same way water slips through desperate fingers. I caught a glimpse of one of the patrol officers speaking urgently into a phone, his face pale, his free hand gesturing wildly toward the gas station and then back at me as if describing a wildfire he couldn't figure out how to stop. Across town, journalists were already typing headlines. I could almost hear them in my mind. Judge assaulted during traffic stop, Supreme Court justice. Targeted by officer, the ugly bait of outrage and spectacle, too tempting for any newsroom to resist. Lieutenant Bennett finished his call and returned to my side, his voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. Judge Carter EMS is en route to document your injuries. The mayor's office and the police chief have both been notified. They're asking to meet with you personally. I shook my head slightly, feeling the weight settle heavier across my shoulders. I'm not interested in photo ops. I said, my voice flat but unyielding. Bennett didn't argue. He simply nodded, once his eyes betraying a glimmer of respect deeper than professional courtesy. Over the next half hour, more patrol cars arrived to secure the scene, not to protect the officer who had caused this mess, but to manage the crowd that had grown from a handful to dozens. Yet still there was no violence, no chaos, just the stubborn solidarity of people refusing to look away, refusing to let the story be buried under official statements and polite euphemisms. And as I stood there battered but unbroken, I realized that this moment, painful and humiliating though it was, had cracked something open far beyond this cracked strip of asphalt. It had forced a reckoning, and no badge, no whispered excuse, no frantic cover story would be enough to sew it shut again. 2 days later, the courtroom was packed tighter than I had ever seen it. The heavy oak benches filled with reporters, local citizens, students with notebooks clutched in nervous hands, and officers who had been ordered to observe, but looked as if they would rather be anywhere else. I sat at the front, flanked by 2 representatives from the State Judicial Oversight Committee. My heart steady, but my body taut like a stretched wire, knowing full well that whatever dignity I reclaimed here today would be hard-won, not gifted. Across the aisle, Brent Walker sat hunched at the defense table. His ill-fitting suit wrinkled, his face hollow and sallow under the fluorescent lights. Beside him, his attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Marla Whitby, whispered urgently into his ear, her motions sharp as if trying to physically shake some strategy into him. But Brent only stared at the table in front of him like a man already halfway gone. When the judge called the courtroom to order, there was a shuffling and collective breath holding, the kind that happens when everyone knows they are about to witness something larger than any single event, something that touches an old raw nerve woven into the very fabric of the country. The prosecution moved swiftly, presenting the evidence with a cool efficiency that needed no embellishment because there it was, frame by damning frame. Brent pulling me from the car without cause. Brent striking me across the face with casual brutality. Brent ignoring the badge, the identification, the humanity staring him in the face. I took the stand. When my time came, my right cheek still a dull darkened purple where his hand had left its mark. Raising my hand and swearing to tell the truth, the entire room seemed to lean forward as I began, my voice low but unwavering, recounting the morning exactly as it had unfolded, sparing no detail, asking for no sympathy. I was treated, I said, pausing only long enough to let the weight of the words settle, as if my life, my dignity could be judged and discarded in a split second based on nothing but an assumption. I felt the room shift again, felt the silent agreement ripple through the onlookers, who had seen too many such moments end without any justice at all. When the defense took their turn, they scrambled, tried to spin a narrative of fear of mistaken identity, but it rang hollow, a tired refrain the jury could smell from a mile away. Officer Walker never looked up at me once, not even when the verdict was read aloud. Guilty on all counts, battery, abuse of authority, violation of civil rights under color of law. There was no applause, no shouts of victory, only a somber kind of relief, A heavy acknowledgement that while this single verdict could not undo centuries of harm, it had managed to pierce through the thick, choking fog of impunity, if only for a moment. As I rose from the witness chair and made my way back down the aisle, the people in the gallery, many of whom I had never met, rose quietly to their feet. No clapping, no cheers, just the simple act of standing bearing witness to a moment that, while far from complete justice, still mattered. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed, cameras, clicking microphones thrust forward, eager to feed the endless appetite for outrage and redemption. But I paused only briefly before speaking into the sea of flashing bulbs, my voice firm but not hard. Justice isn't something that happens by accident, I said. It must be demanded, defended, and carried forward by all of us every single day. In the days that followed the trial, my name was everywhere, flashing across television screens, scrolling across news tickers printed in bold headlines. On the front pages of newspapers I had grown up believing would never find space for stories like mine unless tragedy forced their hand. At first, I tried to tune it out, tried to go about my life, quietly returning to my small brick home at the end of a sleepy street, sipping my coffee in the mornings like nothing had changed. But I knew deep down that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the town of Brookstone, but inside of me. I could see it in the letters that arrived by the hundreds handwritten notes from strangers across the country. Veterans thanking me for standing tall. Young students pledging to pursue law careers because they saw someone who looked like them, refused to back down. Parents writing simply to say that they were grateful their children had seen someone meet injustice, not with rage, but with dignity. One night, as the Texas heat bled into my living room and the cicadas sang their endless chorus outside, I read a message from a teenage girl in Ohio who wrote, "Because of you, I won't be afraid to speak up when I see wrong anymore." I set the letter down carefully, staring out the window into the dark, and for the first time in days allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, something good could be carved out of the wreckage. Invitations flooded in to give speeches, to sit for interviews, to become a face for movements larger than any one story, but I declined most of them. I hadn't stood my ground for applause or accolades, and I wasn't interested in becoming a symbol, stripped of the very humanity I had fought to defend. Instead, I accepted one quiet invitation to speak at a small community forum held at the Brookstone Civic Center, organized not by politicians or activists, but by a group of high school students who simply wanted to understand what justice looked like when it showed up battered but unbroken. That evening, standing at the worn wooden podium before a room packed with teachers, parents, and students whose faces bore the open, unjaded hope of youth, I spoke plainly without prepared remarks, letting my heart do the heavy lifting. Justice, I told them, doesn't always arrive with fanfare and certainty. Sometimes it limps through the door, bruised and tired. Sometimes it fights to be seen against the odds. And sometimes it looks just like you, standing firm when it would be easier to walk away. The room was so still you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, a quiet reverence that wrapped around the words and carried them deeper than any shout ever could. When I finished, they didn't applaud at first. Instead, they rose to their feet, kind of one by one, a ripple of silent respect that moved through the crowd like a wave. And I stood there humbled, letting the moment wash over me without needing to control it. Later that night, as I drove home under a wide starlit sky, the courthouse behind me bathed in soft golden light, I thought about all the unseen battles fought in small towns just like ours, about all the names we would never know, all the dignity defended without cameras or headlines. And I realized that while the story that had started with a slap at a gas station might eventually fade from public memory, the lessons it left behind, the fierce insistence on being seen, the quiet strength of refusing to be diminished, would ripple outward far beyond what I could ever see. And as I pulled into my driveway, the gravel crunching beneath my tires, I smiled. Not because the fight was over, but because I knew deep in my bones that I wasn't standing alone anymore.